Welcome back to chapter 11. In this chapter, Dr. Adams is going to give you a very useful tool that can be used in the relationship to help kickstart communication and problem solving. If you're not in the relationship, also a very effective tool to help you reflect and grow from the experience. That is the letter. So in letter writing, there are a couple of good reasons why letters can be helpful in a relationship and also helpful just for your own sake. The first reason is that a letter helps you to sit down and think and organize your thoughts and communicate them in a way that is constructive. If you're writing a letter, you are in a state that is not emotionally flooded, meaning that simply by sitting down and writing out a letter, you're telling yourself this is not an emergency situation. So that fight, flight, or freeze response that you might have had in a conflict has dissipated. Your logical, critical thinking skills are back into play. Writing is also effective because it helps to connect the two halves of your brain hemisphere. There's a logical side and also an emotional side. So by writing and thinking, you're using that logical side. And also by physically writing, you're helping to connect to your more emotional, creative side as well. And combining these two together as you express what it is you're trying to say. Receiving a letter can be very helpful for the other person because they're able to just sit down and read what you have to say without feeling defensive or threatened or like they have to respond right away like we do in a argument kind of situation. So it gives that person time to actually sit back and absorb what it is you're saying and actually hear it without focusing in on what their response is going to be immediately. There's a good reason why taking the time to sit down and write out what you want to say can be very, very useful. Particularly if you are in a situation where there's been a lot of conflict. So, conflict that is chronic, ongoing, can just lead to a state where there is a lot of defensiveness. People become very protective of themselves and are concerned about being hurt or being rejected. So they tend to remain very defensive. And in a situation where there is constant tension, that can result in just a cease of communication. So going from a lot of arguing and remaining in that kind of high conflict state eventually results in a state of just non-communication where people are no longer talking and no one's really willing to step forward and be the one to get things going again and be vulnerable and risk possibly being rejected or hurt. So it can just be a cease communication. And that's a situation that is particularly dangerous for the relationship because it's one thing to be arguing all the time. It's definitely another thing to just not be talking. So the not talking part means that that relationship is really in danger and something has to be done to kickstart communication because if communication doesn't resume, if problems don't eventually get resolved, there is the likelihood that that relationship will not last. So if you are in a situation where you are no longer in the relationship, sometimes there's a tendency to believe that the problem is solved, the issue is over because I'm no longer with that person, and this type of tool like a letter or focusing in on the relationship that is now over is not useful. It's just going to kind of kick up old stuff. But another way to look at this is that the letter that we're going to be talking about, which does address some feelings from the relationship, may be important because it gives you an opportunity to really reflect and feel some of those things that you haven't been able to do. And by simply detaching and getting away from the relationship doesn't mean that those feelings go away. They're still there. They might be buried a little bit deeper, but they still exist. So by addressing them in the way that we're about to discuss, you're able to kind of constructively deal with some of those feelings, and that leads to sometimes a feeling of freedom, because releasing those old feelings, those old resentments, can very much be a release and can be helpful for you in just actually healing from the relationship, not just leaving the relationship, but healing some of those wounds from the relationship. And also making sure that as you move on and potentially move into a new relationship, you're not dragging some of those old wounds, some injuries, some resentments into a new relationship. That's what I've seen happen is people leave the relationship and believe that the problem is solved because they are no longer with that partner. They enter into a new relationship. Things are very, very good in the beginning, and then it doesn't take long for some conflict in the new relationship to surface. Sometimes people are very surprised because it seems reminiscent of their old relationship. Could be because they selected a partner who had similar characteristics. Could also be that some of those old feelings, those old issues, never got resolved from the previous relationship and are now resurrecting themselves in this new relationship. So the way to avoid doing that is to have this period of honest reflection, addressing some of these issues. And if this kicks up some stuff for you, even consider going further and possibly looking into counseling services that are available, talking to your case manager, but making sure that you do have some serious healing from this past relationship so that you can very effectively transition out of it and move on to your new beginning. So part of what this letter does is helps to move beyond just anger. Now, anger is something that we're all very familiar with. It's a very important emotion. It serves a valuable function. Usually the purpose of anger is to protect. And as we've talked extensively about that fight, flight, or flee mode that is deeply embedded in our survival function, anger serves a very important function when it comes to being in the fight mode. And the fight mode is our instinct to protect and to survive. And that instinct is very, very valuable if you're in an emergency situation and there's a life-threatening event, if you're in combat, if you're in a jungle being chased by a lion. May have been very functional and important to you growing up if there was danger and you had to learn how to survive. Sometimes people can get stuck in that anger mode, which can harm them because it blocks them from underlying emotions and needs, things like hurt and grief. Grief is a very significant emotion if you're in a relationship where there's a lot of conflict, or if you've left a relationship where there's a lot of conflict. Even if you're glad to be away, there's still a grief there, a loss. Remaining angry is functional because it can help protect you from feeling hurt and grief. But not addressing the hurt and grief can also keep you kind of locked into that cycle. Anger may be something that comes very natural. I mean, you may have experienced quite a bit of anger just about this issue. Coming to this class, there might have been anger towards your spouse. And to be fair, it's very likely that you were not the only one who got out of the box in the relationship. There may be some responsibility on your spouse's part, but being focused in on that anger can keep you from progressing, advancing, and gaining some real skills that can help you in the relationship. It also serves to trigger defensiveness from others. And this can be a major block in relationships. If you're approaching situations with anger, triggering defensiveness from your spouse, because naturally we want to protect ourselves. The way to do that is to become defensive and potentially trigger anger back. So what we'll be doing in this letter is going beyond just anger, which probably very familiar with, spent a lot of time focused in on. We're going to switch gears into some other emotions you may have also been experiencing. So the letter that you will be writing addresses 6 primary emotions, the first of which is anger. So you will be looking at what you are angry about, but then going further into regret and sadness, understanding, fear, and finally, love. So that is it. Let's talk about what the homework is for chapter 11. The chapter is going to ask you to write a letter. The letter is to your spouse or to your ex-spouse. So you may write this letter with the intent of actually giving it to them or never giving it to them. But the purpose of this letter is for you. So regardless of whether you're going to actually use this in your relationship or just to reflect back on, the purpose of this letter is for you. You are also the focus of this letter. I encourage you to follow the examples in the book in chapter 11. There are some letters that exemplify what to do and also what not to do. So what not to do is going to be using language that can be blaming, bossy, or hurtful, even if there are some things to be blaming, bossy, and hurtful for in the relationship. Again, the focus of this letter is not on your spouse. The focus of the letter is on you and your feelings. So try to push yourself to go a little bit further in depth, using the examples in the chapter as a guide. Keep the focus on you. You are not writing this letter for your spouse, although you may eventually choose to give it to your spouse. You're not writing this letter for your facilitator. This is for you to honestly reflect on what you've been feeling and help to move forward